Once, in a forgotten village, nestled deep in a dense forest, there stood an eerie, abandoned house at the top of a lonely hill. The villagers whispered stories about it, each one more terrifying than the last. The house was known as the House of Shadows, and no one had dared to approach it for decades. It was said that anyone who tried to enter was either driven mad or vanished without a trace. The air around it always felt heavier, colder, as if it was holding on to something dark, something alive. The village had a long history, but over time, people started leaving. Some believed the land was cursed. The house, with its broken windows and decaying walls, was the source of all the fear. The locals talked of a family that had once lived there. The Winters, they were a well-respected family until one fateful night when the entire family disappeared. No one ever figured out what happened to them, and the mystery surrounding their disappearance only grew with each passing year. But there was one person who was different. Jacob, a curious young boy, grew up hearing the stories, but never believed in the superstitions. He was always told to avoid the house, just like everyone else. But he couldn't help but be drawn to it. He wanted to know the truth. So one cold evening, with nothing but his flashlight and his courage, Jacob decided he would uncover what had really happened. As he made his way up the hill, the wind howled around him, rustling the trees. But he didn't let it shake his resolve. The house loomed in the distance, its outline barely visible through the fog that rolled in from the forest. When he reached the front gate, it creaked loudly, as if it hadn't been opened in years. Jacob hesitated for a moment, but pushed the gate open and stepped inside. The ground beneath his feet was soft and overgrown with weeds, and the house itself seemed even more unsettling up close. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung off its hinges, swaying gently in the wind. With a deep breath, Jacob stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the smell of rot. His flashlight flickered as he scanned the room, revealing peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. The place felt frozen in time. Jacob moved cautiously, the beam of his flashlight casting long shadows across the room. Suddenly, he heard a faint noise. Footsteps, faint but distinct. He spun around, but there was nothing. His heart raced, but he forced himself to keep moving. He couldn't let fear control him now. He knew he had to find out what happened to the Winters. He entered the living room, where a large fireplace stood cold and empty. On the mantel, there were old, tarnished photographs of the Winters. Jacob picked up one of the photos, the faces of the family smiling back at him. But then, something caught his eye. A small, worn book tucked beneath the photo frame. He opened it carefully, and inside was a diary written in elegant yet shaky handwriting. As he flipped through the pages, the words began to change. The ink seemed to move on its own, and the once legible text became distorted. Panic rose in his chest. The book was speaking to him. No, it was alive. A cold breeze swept through the room, and the temperature dropped drastically. Jacob's breath came out in visible puffs, and the flashlight began to flicker. Suddenly, the floor creaked behind him. He spun around, but this time he didn't see nothing. He saw her, a pale, ghostly figure, dressed in tattered clothing. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, and she was floating toward him. her hands outstretched, fingers long and bony. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice a raspy, hollow sound. "You should not have come here." Before he could react, the flashlight went out completely, plunging him into darkness. The room was silent, except for the sound of his own heartbeat. Jacob felt a cold hand brush against his cheek, and he screamed in terror. The ghostly figure was now standing in front of him, her face mere inches from his. She spoke again, this time louder, her voice filled with sorrow. "They took everything from us," she murmured. "Now, you will be one of us." In a blind panic, Jacob tried to run, but the door slammed shut in front of him with a deafening crash. The walls of the house seemed to close in around him, and the shadows grew longer, more oppressive. The figure of the woman reached for him again, but Jacob, trembling with fear, pushed past her and ran toward the window. With a final burst of adrenaline, he crashed through the glass and fell into the bushes below. His body was bruised and bloodied, but he didn't care. He ran down the hill, never looking back, the sound of the wind and the whispers of the house chasing him the entire way. The next morning, Jacob returned to the village, shaken to his core. He tried to tell the townspeople what he had experienced, but no one would listen. They all said the same thing. The house is cursed. It claims the souls of those who dare to enter. But Jacob knew the truth. The Winters were still there, trapped in the house forever, and the curse had claimed him as well. From that day on, Jacob was never seen again. The villagers would still hear faint whispers coming from the hill at night, whispers of Jacob, forever lost in the shadows of the haunted house on the hill.